You're with the briefing here on BBC News. Let's remind you of the headlines. Leaders of 4 of the countries most affected by rising sea levels will give an impassioned plea to a key UN climate summit in Poland today. Theresa May's Brexit deal will come under more scrutiny, with opposition parties calling for the government to publish its legal advice on the withdrawal agreement in full. So let's talk about those stories and others that the global media is grappling with today. So if we start with the front page of the Financial Times, it's looking at climate change, talking about Royal Dutch Shell setting carbon emissions targets from next year. And these will be linked to executive pay. And this is following the intense pressure from shareholders that want fossil fuel companies to take more responsibility for their contribution to global warming. Front page of the Eye looks at what we've been discussing with regards to this week in Parliament. Parliament versus Downing Street, it says, the constitutional crisis that is looming, with the Prime Minister refusing to show Brexit legal advice to MPs in full. In France, you can imagine all the dailies are focused. This is Le Figaro on what's been happening in Paris. A photo there of the Arc de Triomphe during Saturday's violent protests there, which it says has left France in shock following the worst riots for decades. BBC News Online is looking at children who are today far more likely than ever before to develop food allergies. The rise in allergies in recent decades, according to a recent study, has been particularly noticeable in the West. And finally, the Irish Times warns its readers of possible huge phone bills for passengers on Aer Lingus flights who do not switch off their phones during transit. We will explain why. Eileen is back, as promised. Eileen Burbidge, co-founder and partner at Passion Capital, an early-stage venture capital company based here in London. Eileen, let's get started. Okay. So this story, front and centre of the Financial Times, Shell taking action. Yeah, absolutely. It's the very first of the energy companies, so it's really putting a stake in the ground. And a big reversal, by the way, by its chief executive, who earlier this year, just this summer, said it would be foolish to try and actually impose targets. It would just open them up for litigation, basically making your sort of standard excuses, but now doing an about-face and saying, right, as you noted, they're going to tie this to executive compensation. It's going to affect the top 1,200 employees at the company, and they're going to actually set targets, which also include, by the way, use by its consumers. So not just the company's specific carbon footprint, but all of that of its products as well. For those meeting in Poland today, those UN leaders and others there, including David Attenborough, I would imagine this is great news for them. Absolutely. They need more of this. We need more of this worldwide, don't we, if we're going to really try and reduce the global warming, which is one of the most critical issues facing the world, many would argue. Yeah, no, completely. And it's interesting because there's another story that you already prefaced about what's happening with the Paris riots and, of course, why those started. And so those were originally in response to the increase on the diesel tax. So we're seeing a lot of, really competing forces about what we have to do. But you're absolutely right. It's a real crisis. There's a lot of overlap going on for sure. But I mean, for the likes of Shell and some of its arch rivals, BP, Exxon and others, I mean, these companies are the bread and butter of most pension funds, around the world, the good old-fashioned energy stock. And people, more and more people, savvy investors want to see ethical, climate change friendly investment. I mean, in some of the big investment banks around the world are actually providing a very eco-friendly funds, aren't they, for people to invest in? Yeah, and that's actually what's led to this. Well, part of what's led to this is the Climate Action 100 Plus group, which is a group of activist shareholders or people who take an interest in what the companies they've invested in are doing. They're the ones who have continued to actually say, you need to do something and you need to change your position. It's great. So let's see if others follow suit. We'll get to Paris in a moment. You've mentioned Paris. We'll get to there in a second. But let's look at the front page of the Eye. But many other papers in the UK have this. Parliament versus Downing Street, looking at the fact that, the Attorney General today will deliver the legal basis for the withdrawal agreement. But it's a very sort of truncated document that they will show to MPs. It's not the full story, is it? Exactly. And that's the crux of it. I think that actually the PM doesn't want to show the full documentation, so there's going to be a really big sort of controversial Q&A, and I think a conversation about that in Commons today, where the PM coming back from the G20 is going to say, listen, this is what you need to know, this is the best deal that we can get, and she's going to continue trying to push her position. But all the while, there's this question about what is it that you won't show us, and why can't we go through that full process? And in many ways, looking at this, you would think why would MPs not want to see the full document before they make that decision on December the 11th, which is historic, enormous decision for the UK, for everyone who lives in the UK, for those that will come, you know, generations ahead. You would think that you know, politicians, those who have been elected to sit in Parliament, should see the full document.
And you'd think people, sort of citizens, newspaper readers, we'd want to see it too. So it doesn't seem unreasonable that MPs would want to see the full text of the actual discussion. I don't think it's unreasonable to have that debate and to ask the PM why she's withholding it. I can only assume that the government feels like this is the best way in order to position the current agreement and to say, listen, this is so much better than a no-deal Brexit. Of course, as we know, and what all the other papers are saying, is that maybe there's another choice as well. But this is why, as you mentioned today on Twitter, this is another critical day for the PM.
It's another critical day. I feel like I'm going to be saying that for the next...
I think you are, for the next 8 days.
December 11th, that's
8 more
for sure.
days.
Well, let's look at Le Figaro then, and its article and its coverage of what's going on in Paris. It talks about Paris, you know, France is in shock. I must admit, I was in Paris very recently with my 3 young boys, and we were whizzing around the, you know, the Arc de Triomphe, up and down the Champs-Élysées, doing all the tourist stuff. I mean, it is shocking what's going on in there, and the level of protest. And it's different this time as well. It's not sort of led by unions, the sort of regular protests we see across France. This has got a different feel to it.
It does have a different feel, and I think that's the reason why, you know, Macron flew back and actually held an emergency meeting, because what started as very peaceful protests and what started as protests against a rise in the duty against diesel, which is what I was alluding to earlier, has clearly now taken a really darker turn. And it's really unfortunate because you have, you know, masked people running through the streets that are clearly prepared for violence. They're carrying, you know, little vials of, you know, eye drops in order to sort of counteract against tear gas. They're really prepared to start vandalizing and actually destroying the city. And so... And
that has been happening.
That has been happening.
Pictures of, you know, various really important parts of France.
Hundreds of people being hurt. Yeah, hundreds of people being hurt, people being, you know, hospitalized, people dying. It's causing a bit of a problem. And Macron is saying, listen, I've got sort of my political opponents who are using this as an excuse to rally their supporters to try and make this a much darker protest and a much darker movement. So he really does need to get a grip on it.
This is always the concern about any protests of this sort of nature here in the UK, wherever in France, that others, smaller militant
factions,
groups will hijack what actually is quite a peaceful protest about some very important issue. In terms of France, I mean, his approval ratings have been falling for quite some time now. How he handles this for him personally is as important as it is for, you know, policy in France, isn't it?
It's unquestionably his sort of biggest challenge since he's actually been in office in the last 18 months. So how he responds in the next week and whether or not he can get the sort of mood to dissipate slightly, and having asked, you know, his sort of Prime Minister to make sure to meet with some of these groups, hopefully that kind of abates it.
Yeah, we shall keep an eye for sure. Looking at pictures now of him looking around Paris, as you say, he hot-footed it back from Buenos Aires to be seen to be there. It's important he's he's in France when this is happening, and not in Buenos Aires with G20. Okay, let's have a look now. This story that I noticed today on our website, on the health page, why the world's becoming more allergic to food. Around the world, children are far more likely than ever before to develop food allergies. Why is that?
Yeah, they don't know. There's a lot of mixed sort of theories about it, but, you know, unquestionably, the sort of I read that the increase in peanut allergies, for example, in the last 20 years has increased 5-fold. So this is a problem. But as you alluded to, it seems to be happening more in Western countries. So there's a question about whether or not there is a climate-related issue that's environmental, whether or not, you know, we have enough sort of antibodies within our sort of systems, whether or not we're getting enough vitamin D, for example. So there's a lot of different theories, but we haven't been able to actually...
And we need to figure out what's going on here, don't we? I mean, those who sort of research this kind of thing need to get on the case. I remember when, you know, when I was going through my pregnancies, we were told as pregnant mums, okay, don't eat peanuts, don't eat this, don't eat that, because that could then lead to peanut allergy. But actually, since then, that advice has changed. We're just told different things all the time.
That's true. And that's because all of this is changing and people aren't able to figure out what the actual control elements are in order to figure out what's actually triggering these things.
This is big business, isn't it?
It's big business, and it's also dangerous.
In the health supplement industry and all that kind of area, a lot of companies jump on this bandwagon and make a fortune.
Of course, but then at the same time you've got people dying, right? So we've had the 2 high-profile deaths in recent weeks, and that's what's really bringing it under the microscope.
Now, what's going on with Aer Lingus? Eileen, passengers could
This
face
story made me
massive
chuckle.
phone bills. What on
I
earth are they doing?
shouldn't be laughing because it's awful. This is awful. This is really bad because I actually genuinely believe this is a problem for Aer Lingus and this is something that they can control.
So what's happening?
What's happening is on transatlantic flights, if customers don't turn their phones off or put them onto airplane mode or into flight mode, and therefore they're on mobile networks, they could potentially get switched over to a roaming network supplied by the
Whilst in
flight.
midair.
Yes, exactly, by the airline carrier, and then therefore rack up international roaming charges even if they're not using their phones. Now, Aer Lingus has said, actually in the Irish Times, that they're not benefiting economically. I don't buy that. I think that's absolutely categorically untrue. They're the ones that put those antennas on the plane, and they're actually saying that for safety reasons, they encourage users to switch off their phones. That may or may not be true or justified, but that's only for takeoff and landing. The fact that they have these mobile antennas allowing people to roam means that they know that that's a possibility, they know it's a feasibility, and they're offering that service, but they're gouging customers. There's a customer who recently came home to a $300 bill. So that's absolutely, you know.
That's a little bit more than your whiskey on your flight, isn't
That's
it? Or your
horrific.
bit of duty free. Eileen, thank you very much. Thanks so much for coming in. Thank you too for your company, and whatever you're up to today, I hope you have a good day. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.